Glory to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Jesus went on with his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake, for the sake of the gospel, will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed, when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." The Gospel of Christ.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Christ, light bearer, open the light of your word to all of us. In your name, amen. As a preface, when I was preparing, there were really 2 sermons, so I'm not going to do the second, which is on that wonderful first reading about the tongue and the word, the power of words. So I've instructed Rob to stop at slide 10 and whisk on to the next. And that'll be a sermon in my pocket for another time. So I've concentrated on the gospel. Now, when I was a young girl, I heard this, and you may have as well, from my elders, saying, "Oh, she has such a cross to bear in that husband." Or, "He visits his mother every weekend, and she does nothing but complain. What a cross he bears." I asked what was my cross, and my elders would say forebodingly, "Just you wait. You don't need to look for your crosses, Janet. Life gives them to you. Suffering comes, suffering happens." When I hear, as you do, of the recent Hurricane Florence, forest fires, floods, and see people who have lost their homes, I think that in the flood that is this life, some waters will sweep your home away, and others stop at your doorstep. I bailed out in the wee hours of the night as a little girl, a torrential rain coming down our back hill and into the house. We all helped, but it never rose beyond the front hall. There's no choosing, no deserving in a flood rising or receding. On any given day, one of us could be picnicking and one of us swimming for our lives. We are grateful when suffering leaves us alone, and every instinct in us says to avoid it, protect ourselves against it, deny it, just as Peter did. For Peter, Messiah meant something quite specific, something involving horses and swords and armies, vanquished enemies, and, well, winning. Jesus' response didn't make sense to Peter. Suffering and torture and death on a cross? What kind of salvation plan is this? How is this abundant life? Peter longs for divine things, Jesus says, yet he grapples, like we, with human things. And understandably so. This is a hard and harsh teaching that Jesus is engaged in as he speaks. of what is to come. How can Peter, who just moments ago declared Jesus to be Messiah, think of letting Peter go? So Peter rebukes Jesus, and Jesus rebukes him right back, calling him Satan and chastising him for setting his mind on human things rather than divine things. And so one might wonder whether the intense energy that Jesus puts into this pretty strong response indicates that he is not merely upbraiding Peter, but also reminding himself where his own focus must be. Now, occasionally in the labor room, and I'm looking around and I know that a lot of you have been in a labor room, and I don't just mean women, you see a woman doing what she needs to do, coping as she can in pain and sounding like it. A sweet, supportive partner comes to her, gently holds her hand and softly says, "It's okay, honey. It's not that bad. Just breathe, it'll be okay." To which she replies, "This is not okay. It's not going to be okay. Okay?" Well, the poor partner's face at that point is as much as I could imagine the face of the well-meaning but somewhat oblivious Peter as he tried to redirect Jesus. Jesus, who knew well what his own labor of love would require, and that it would not be okay, not the way Peter meant. Jesus tells the disciples, let them deny themselves and take up their cross. He doesn't say that his followers should take up the cross that will be his own to bear, or that we should carry a cross that someone else forces upon us. Rather, Jesus compels us to find the particular path that will enable us to do the work of giving up all that separates us from God and one another, and, importantly, from our deepest self. As Peter learned, this includes releasing our desire to dictate the actions of others in ways we are not meant to do, and letting go of our attachment to outcomes that lie beyond our control. And it's a strange thing that this kind of denial, this kind of detachment, actually makes for deeper connections in our lives. So self-denial is a tricky practice, and the Christian tradition has not always done a good job of explaining it. It can be hard, after all, to wrap our brains around the idea that self-denial doesn't mean giving up who we are at our core, the self that God created us to be. But rather, Jesus' words here call us to recognize and release whatever hinders us from full relationship with God and one another and ourselves. So self-denial challenges us to know those stumbling blocks within our own selves. It beckons us to open ourselves to the one who is the source and creator of our deepest self. And it compels us to ask, what are the actions, what is the way of being that will leave the greatest amount of room for God's love and grace and compassion to move in and through me? The answer to that question won't be the same for everyone. And that's another thing that has made self-denial so tricky in the Christian tradition. A single form of self-denial won't fit for all. And one of the greatest ways we can harm ourselves and others is to follow a path that's not meant for us. Martin Luther King followed the path of civil rights activism in the 60s, and he's seen here removing a burning cross left along with other death threats on his front lawn. And beside him, you're right, that's his young son, whom he loves more than life, and like all of us, wants to live to an old age to see his son grow. Martin knows to follow his path means the risk of someone avenging his life. The cross Christ died on was an instrument of pain and shame and absolute loss and death. It was a real weapon. The only way to take it up was to become, for Christ, its victim. And it does remain a risk for every one of us who's a disciple of Jesus Christ, blessed as we are to live in such a tolerant country. So how do you discern what we should be fierce about? How do we choose what we will hold on to and what we need to release? If anyone wants to become my follower, Let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Some crosses are made of what we take on, and some crosses are what we let go. Always the cross that Christ invites us to is the place where our desires and Christ's desires find their meeting place. And all that distracts us from Christ falls away. I think for Martin Luther King in this photo, and at the age of 22, he is getting ready for his mugshot before he goes to jail in Montgomery, Alabama, after his 1956 arrest while protesting segregation in the city buses. He knows, you can see it on his face, what he's giving up. Opportunities that a criminal record will close for a career, running for political office, safety for him and possibly his family. It's a lot to lose. But he believes it's worse to lose himself because he is afraid. In this photo of a line of men marching on Labor Day for workers' rights, their signs read, "I am a man." They wear their powerful peace reminder that all justice, all we will risk to take up our cross is to secure the basic human right to respect one another, to become fully who we are. You can find one person who intentionally for impact does not wear the sign as a further support at that time of equal rights and respect for all. So what are we attached to now? How do we know when a treasured expectation, desire, or relationship has become a stumbling block to Christ, leading you to being fully you in loving relationship with Him? Who or what helps you to recognize these blocks and supports you as you pass and move through them? Jesus does not encourage us to search out and embrace or welcome suffering for the sake of suffering. His invitation to take up the cross does not mean to accept or condone abuse of any kind. We know his whole life was about protecting the vulnerable. His call is to deny yourself and take up the cross so that you can follow freedom and peace. Barbara Brown Taylor expresses it this way: the deep secret of Jesus' hard words to us is that our fear of suffering and death robs us of life. Because fear of death always turns into fear of life and into a kind of stingy, cautious way of living that's not really living at all. The deep secret of Jesus' hard words is that the way to have abundant life is not to save it, but to spend it, to give it away, because life cannot be shut up and saved. And it doesn't mean giving up our humanness. It means learning to see what is within our humanness that hinders us from God and letting that go. It means sometimes not clinging to human desires at the expense of seeking to know God's desire for our life, which is always good. The ant who annoys you is not your cross to bear. The cross is not an annoyance, nor something thrust upon you. It's your free, willing, and unresentful choice to be gentle, nonviolent, for the sake of justice, to be vulnerable for the sake of healing, and to open yourself to other people's suffering, to enter into the shame of the world with the enormous grace of God. It's to enter this fierce longing that God has, and it's in you and I, for wholeness of life for ourselves and for others. And to trust that God will be our security and our power, that grace is absolute and death is relative. The world can get along without us, but not without our love. Forgiveness is more powerful than force. Love is stronger than fear and more lasting than death, more real than anything else. I want to share with you, I'm going to skip ahead. So when people talk about their crosses, their sinus trouble, their rebellious children, even their pimples, or a harsh work environment, or arthritis, or marriage breakdown, and unemployment, drunken partners, or mortgage repayments, the list is endless. That is what not our cross. Those are real human conditions, and they are trials. But a lot of times these are things that we bear by being human. It may be your genetic coding. But if you've got it and you have to live with it as best you can, whether or not you follow Jesus. Mortgage repayments are not a consequence of following Jesus. They're a consequence of choosing to purchase your own house. And if you make that choice, you'll have to bear the burden of paying the mortgage, whether or not you follow Christ. Unemployment is not usually a consequence of following Jesus. It's a consequence of living in a society that has more people than jobs. The decision to follow Jesus will not likely impact on your unemployment. But these are facts of life for all of us. They are the price of being human. For Jesus, he's just explained to Peter that taking up your cross means literally being willing even to be killed for what he was committed to. And we know when he arrived in Jerusalem, the religious and national leaders gave him a simple choice: back down or we'll have you killed. So he either had to walk away from the things he had been saying and doing, who he was, and stop rocking the boat, or he had to hold his ground and pay the ultimate price for it. Those who want to be my followers must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. If you choose to stand with me, you have to be willing to cope with the consequences. And very few people see that after he said he will die, he says he will rise. And so that is the ultimate consequence in our following Christ. I want to close with two personal stories. So I'm going to flip right through to them. This week my mother died. Something else happened 3 days before. I came home from the Renew meeting Tuesday, and I was preparing to put chlorine in my pool. I did not wear my safety glasses. I have a problem. I believe I live in a bubble of protection, and I know I need to wear them. I have been to the emergency before, and sure enough, I got a splashback. So I got concentrate chlorine in my right eye, and I already lost some sight from the other one for that. So I got myself 40 minutes later to emergency, where the doctor explained chlorine is worse than acid for corroding your eye. Having waited before coming and splashing water on my eye and showering, enough time had passed to start the damage. I had no idea I was in for a 14-hour hospital stay with suction cups on my eyes, dripping solution into them over exactly hours, and they did it 3 times. It was, for me, excruciating painful, anxiety-inducing, because I have an eye phobia. No one can touch my eyes. And they put needles in and freezings. And at one point I said, no, I won't do that anymore. And if you don't take them off, I will pull them out. I have to be at my mother's in the morning. I was told they couldn't force me to stay, but they said if I go, they would not take responsibility for the fact I could go blind. The test showed the chlorine was still active. I can't tell you how I struggled. I'm a mature woman. I cried. I think I called the nurses a lot. I wanted to leave so bad, but I wanted my sight more. So I stayed and prayed and got through it. I needed Jesus' help. I think the cross takes us to defining moments when we really don't want to go forward with Jesus, and what in our heart and conscience we know we have to do. And he won't force us, but to say no, we have to know we have lost something precious, something of immeasurable value. I wanted to place my trust in my fear. And the doctor and nurses were saying, trust them. Think of the consequences of turning away. Think of the reward of staying in the hospital. And for me, in many times in my life and yours, staying with Jesus is the way we choose. I couldn't see Mom for a few days, precious days, and I had to trust that those in the family seen her on my day to go were okay, and conveyed my love until I could go a few days later. And the day she died, in fact. And yes, I have some damage, but it's minor. And I will now have to get proper glasses, not just reading glasses at the dollar store. So the last story is one from Bill. His story is different, but with the same message, and I'll leave you with it. What led him to the cross? He had stomach flu, and he should have been in bed, but he's a superhero at the office, so he drove, and he got into a bad car accident. He was grateful he didn't plow people down or other motorists. He plowed down some mailboxes before he landed in someone's garden and proceeded to pass out in a snowbank, where he tried to get out. And when he came to, there were paramedics standing over him. And the first thing he said is, "I'm not drunk." He said, "I hated the idea of going home and going to bed because it was a disruption to my driven personality. See, I had a solution for the fact that I had spent years of my life being a complete screw-up. And that solution was to place my trust in my ability to perform. My solution to the problem of having squandered years of my life to addiction was to then just become addicted, to proving myself. And then that solution turned into its own problem. And that's usually how the cycle goes. I realize that perhaps there's a connection between addiction and the me-based solutions that fail us, and the cross we are called to take up. And when I speak of addicts, I speak of all of us, not just those who have bottomed out in such messy ways that end up in detox. I mean all of us. Any human being who has something in which they place their trust, anything that we mistakenly think will solve our problems. We can be addicted to control, to food, to gardening the admiration of others, to career advancement, to anger, to entertaining ourselves, to self-pity. Any number of things, just as much as we can be addicted to heroin or gin and tonics or Valium or gambling. See, he says, I just don't think it's entirely avoidable. Humans will always place our trust in things that will fail us. We will always insist on giving pieces of our heart to things that simply cannot love us back. So if making more money doesn't manage to make you feel secure in the way you were sure it would, when finally being in a relationship doesn't make you feel worthwhile in the way you thought it would, when the success of your children doesn't make up for your own feelings about yourself, or getting a degree make you feel valuable, know that the one thing you probably avoided is asking Jesus to help you take up the cross. It's not suffering. It's being willing to live more fully and boldly because you're following him. I just have a blessing to tell you at the end. So just to end, just to us to recap, let's remember to deny ourselves is not punishing ourselves or taking on misery. That's not what Jesus wants for any of us. It's not to live in denial or turn your back on who you are. It's the opposite. We are members of the infinite body of God who dwells in us and we in God. We are sustained not by our own protection of our little lives, but by the life-giving fountain of grace welling up within us to eternal life, flowing with perfect, infinite compassion. May Christ bless your path and be your path in the days to come. Amen.